Burn the box.
Thank you. Please. Good morning. Mr. De Gucht, I would like to ask you first a couple of questions about the current timing, because this is a big week for the European Union. We just got a president, we just got a representative of foreign affairs. And I come from Italy, and when we look at Mr. Van Rompuy, he's not particularly well known outside of Belgium, let's say like that. Some people have been a bit disappointed about his nomination because they expected somebody more flamboyant and somebody well known on the world stage. You have worked with him in government. Can you tell us what kind of leader is he possibly going to be?
I have been for 3 days last week in your country, in Italy. And there was a lot of talk about Mr. D'Alema becoming the High Representative.
Absolutely, yes.
He isn't known in Belgium either, I must say.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
But what kind of man he is? I've worked with him because I have been one of his vice prime ministers in the Belgian government. And I know him also for quite a longer time, having negotiated with him a government agreement as well. He is a very intelligent man. So he's not only intelligent, he's an intellectual, which is still a little difference, especially in politics. He is also somebody who is he's a very able politician. He knows how to negotiate. He can make good judgments whether something can be done or can't be done. So he's a very able politician. He's European. He is. I don't know whether he's really a federalist. Probably a little bit more than others, than other Belgians. But you know, and he's certainly somebody who is an Atlanticist. But I myself, I'm a federalist, and I hope it to be for the rest of my life. But I also realize that it's not going to come about during my lifetime. You see, so. I think that for the kinds of steps we will be able to take, and I hope we will be able to take in the next 5 years, he will be a good chairman of the European Council. He's not a president, because Europe is not a presidential regime. And I don't think that it will become anytime soon. I mean, you could not install a system as you have it in France with the president. I mean, that's a real president, and the function has been invented by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and he was the presiding the European Convention. Now, of course, he only could think of himself when designing this function, but it took 8 years before the Treaty of Lisbon came about.
So it was too late after.
And he grew a little bit too old. Yes,
exactly. One of the impressions is that Europe has been going through a long period of inward-looking kind of approach. So extending the borders, setting up the whole infrastructure for the institutions, the common currency, and so on. And many people were kind of hoping that now Europe would start to look outwards and become more active on the world stage. Is that gonna happen in a way or another? Is there a willingness to act and to act more?
Well, I think Europe is already reaching out on the world scene, but in a different way than, for example, the United States is doing, although not necessarily less successful. Europe works by means of soft power. And when you look at the period since the Second World War, you could ask yourself, what has been the most successful? Is it the soft power or is it the hard power? You know this image of Venus and Mars, and we are Venus, which is in itself, I think, a very good idea. And the Americans are Mars. But when you look at what happened since the Second World War, they have not been that successful with the hard power. And I think the soft power has been very successful. For example, the whole enlargement of the European Union. We have been establishing a Pax Europea. After the Second World War, we had the Pax Americana, and now we have the Pax Europea. So, and it's working very well. Of course, there are still problems in some new member states with corruption, functioning of the institutions. You see also a very swift change of political majorities in some new member states. But nevertheless, this is a very huge difference since what we have gone through until 20 years ago. So I think it is already very successful on the world scene. Are additional steps possible? I mean, that's, I think, your question. We should realize that this High Representative, Cathy Ashton, but that would have been the case with any other High Representative, will have to act on the basis of the consensus of 27 member states.
Exactly.
One of the big changes in the Lisbon Treaty is that now we are going to decide largely with qualified majority within the co-decision procedure, co-decision between the Council and the Parliament. This is not the case for classical international politics, which means international politics, security and defense still will be governed by consensus. There's a little evolution whereby you could have so-called positive abstentions, which means that you agree that the others go ahead. It's also possible to find means and ways whereby a more limited number of member states could go ahead without the others opposing. But nevertheless, this is still going to harm us on the world scene. So the High Representative will be bound, probably also limited, by the consensus of 27 member states. And so the proper area of movement, the proper area of policy that she or he could make with a personal impetus will be rather limited. So we should realize that. So we should not have too high expectations with respect to classical international policy.
Did you just say that this is going to harm Europe on the world stage? So limit the capacity of Europe to act?
Well, I didn't say harm, I said limit.
Okay.
Because, but there is certainly a limitation. Yeah. I mean, the way that, I mean, let's keep it to the nationality. The way that Miliband will be able to operate and the way that Cathy Ashton will be able to operate will be completely different. Totally. He will be working with the Foreign Office, which is considered to be the best diplomatic service in Europe. She still has to put it into place, but I mean, this will take some time, but it's certainly possible. He can act on the basis of a government that has a majority in Parliament. If it has no majority anymore, it falls. And she will have to act on the basis of consensus. That's the difference. But on the other hand, she will be representing 500 million citizens on the world scene, and Miliband will only be representing a former empire.
I'm sure that both Miliband, Brown, and Cameron would like that to hear a definition. That's actually a very good TV clipping for tonight. Let's talk a little bit about your current portfolio. You're currently in charge of development and humanitarian aid. Europe provides already more than half of all humanitarian aid in the world. It's still short of the UN target of 0.7% of GDP. Is that gonna increase in any way? Will there be a different push, or will there be a shift in policy in that field?
I think we have to do both. I think on the one hand, we have there needs to be more, better, and faster aid. I'm convinced of that. Europe is representing 60% of the official aid worldwide. Yeah. So we are the market leader, let's say. And I think when you have a position as a market leader, you also have to be innovative. I mean, you need the flexibility to look for other solutions. And I'm sure that a lot can be done better. We have just been producing a report on the aid efficiency. where it becomes clear that if we become more efficient, if we also work together in a more logical way between the European Commission and the member states, that we can save up to easily 5 billion euros on a yearly basis, which is a huge amount of money that we would need to reinvest in the developing world. I mean, it's incredible. Any member state is active in 10, 15, 20 developing countries in several sectors, where also other member states are active. They have a very little share of what is happening in a specific developing country, only a couple of projects. All that is lost money. So we really should become much more effective, but it's also a political question. Not only in Belgium, but in all the member states, it's a political question, because you have classical, traditional ties with certain developing states. You want to keep them. You regard them, you look upon them as kind of a property, I would say. Then there are the NGOs. They have also inclinations to certain sectors. There are too many NGOs. They are too small. Maybe you don't realize, but currently, and that's like that for already quite some time, the European Commission, together with the member states, you speak about 40,000 projects. 40,000 projects. So a lot can be done there, but I'm also convinced that aid cannot be missed.
There is actually a big debate about this. There's a big debate about aid versus investment and trade. Whether we should just put more money into direct aid, or whether we should go a different kind of route. And we left some of that actually this morning here. One school says, well, all we need is more money for aid, and another school says, actually more money and aid may even hurt. The Mbisa Moyo, for example, is in the second group. And then there is an emerging kind of synthesis of these two positions, which is about a mix of aid for emergencies in very poor countries and investment and trade for the rest. What's your?
I know I read the book by Ms. Moyo, so I know her thesis, and I think it's refreshing that there starts to be a debate on development aid. I've tried to do so also as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Belgium. I was also involved, let's say, in the strategic thinking about development aid. So I think these kind of books are very valuable, but do not necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. You have humanitarian help and humanitarian aid. That's of course necessary. There also the European Commission is by far the biggest donor worldwide. Then you have development aid, where you need more efficiency, more long-term strategies. We have to fine-tune the budget support, which is, I think, a very valuable tool, but not an easy one to manage. You need investment. It's obvious you need investment. You need trade. That's why we try to get the Doha round to a conclusion. And when you discuss, for example, about trade, then there is a lot of talk on import duties and all that kind of thing. It doesn't. I think in the end it has very little to do with that. It has to do with the ability to export. Then you're speaking about conditioning of products being okay for the European and for the international markets. It's about having the possibility to get your production to the not only the international but also to the local markets, and you need investment in roads and so on. The whole chapter of aid for trade to me is very, very important. You can only have trade if there is first aid for trade, so that you get the capabilities, human capabilities, but also the infrastructural capabilities to really trade with each other. And it's not only a problem north-south, it's at least the same in the south-south direction and yes. Between countries in Africa, for example, even neighboring countries.
Well, since you mentioned Africa, that's actually one of your personal passions and interest. where is the good news from Africa, from your point of view? Are there a couple of examples of the right path to development that you can mention?
Well, I have been traveling a lot in Africa, and not
That
only
tells us there are only a few minutes left.
not only recently, since about 30 years, and the problem is that it's hardly going better than 30 years ago. It is in some countries, yes, but in many it's going worse. Some speak about a lost continent. I don't want to speak in those terms, but it's obvious that this is a very big problem how to approach Africa, and I'm more and more convinced that it will take a lot of time. Having made a lot of analysis of what is going wrong in that continent, just two thoughts. I think one of the problems with the African elites is that they have it very difficult to reason in long-term perspectives, and also in bigger, how would I say, institutions, entities, structures, you name it. There is another interesting approach, which is to say that they are in fact living in another era, that they are not yet living in the 21st century. And I think that there is some truth in this, but it also means that we should bear this in mind when we work with Africa. We should give them all the chances that they deserve, but they should also take more and more responsibility.
But yet there are some interesting things happening. There are countries that have been stabilized, like Rwanda, for example, or Ghana. There is an incredible lot of infrastructure being built in Africa, not much with the help of Europeans, mostly with the help of the Chinese and the Asians, for example. How do you look at that? There has been this huge influx, for example, of Chinese money into Africa recently.
Well, there's a lot of discussion on that also. First, of course, I think it's very interpelling. Because you cannot look away from the fact that in China itself, within 25 years, I mean, many more people came out of absolute poverty than as a result of 50 years of development aid. I mean, it's a fact of life. So it's a little bit too easy to criticize them all the time. On the other hand, it's also obvious that the Chinese do pay much less attention to fundamental rights than we do, to human rights. And they are now offering, let's say, a second possibility to quite some African rulers, if not dictators. So that is also obvious. On the other hand, when you look at the infrastructural works of the Chinese in Africa, they have been doing that for quite some time. I mean, most of the sports stadiums in Africa have been built by the Chinese. They have, by the way, all of them have the same architecture, so they are very recognizable and ugly.
I wouldn't call that crucial infrastructure.
When I look at what they are doing recently, I see two tendencies. First, they engage in very big infrastructure projects, and they, first of all, serve their own activities in Africa. For example, mining. Look at what they are proposing for the DRC, and look what mines they are going to exploit. You connect it, and you have the
somehow
same.
Is not different.
And
from
you have the same grid.
Europeans used to do in past decades.
I think I started by saying that it's a little bit too easy to simply criticize them. On the other hand, they also realize, and they start realizing, it's very obvious when you go to China and you speak to think tanks, for example, they also start realizing that sustainability of their investments is also for them important. Mining means a lot of investments in terms of billions of dollars. So it's important that you have a stable regime, that there are institutions that work properly, that the tax environment is stable, so that also governance becomes more and more important for themselves, for their own interests. And so I think that we are coming, I wouldn't say we are coming together, but at least now we can speak about our differences, and that's quite different from 5 or 10 years ago, I think.
We are out of time, but I wanted to end with your personal circumstances, because the Commission is being reshuffled. probably in 10 days or a couple of weeks, we will know who the new commissioners are. It's widely assumed you will remain in the commission. I was wondering whether you can tell us about which kind of portfolio would you like to have in the next commission, if you plan to change?
No.
You don't plan to change, or do you want to? No, you don't want to say, or no, you are not planning to change?
I'm not going to say anything about it.
Okay. Well, rumors want that you are looking at the portfolio of energy. Anyway, Commissioner, thank you very much. An applause for Commissioner Van Gogh.